2008, Sara worked for Governor Jack Markle, and in 2010, for former Attorney General Bill Biden. Prior to coming to HRC, Sara worked on LGBTQ equality at the Center for American Progress and interned at the White House, the first out trans woman to do so. Sara became the first openly transgender person to address a major party political convention when she spoke at the 2016 Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia. We are absolutely thrilled that she is our TIE's keynote speaker this year. Please help me welcome her to the stage, Sara Mcbride.
For inviting me and for organizing this wonderful conference. This is actually my second time at Virginia Ties. I came to the first one in 2014. It was actually shortly after my husband Andy passed away, who, as many of you know, was a transgender activist. And it was the first event that I did after his passing. And it helped me re-involve and re-energize myself in this movement. And so I'm eternally grateful for James and Equality Virginia for that opportunity and that moment of healing for me. And so it's wonderful to be back here among family. Finally, I want to thank all of you for coming out today. Because I believe that we are at a critical moment in the fight for transgender equality and the fight for LGBTQ equality more broadly. Right now, we must decide as a nation whether we will be a country that says there's only one way to love, only one way to look, and only one way to live, or whether we will be a nation where everyone has the freedom to live openly and equally. We are in a battle for the soul and story of this country. And right now, marginalized people in this country are facing a nearly unprecedented level of attacks in modern political history. Our community in particular has found itself in the crosshairs. Just a few weeks after taking office, Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Betsy DeVos, and Jeff Sessions rescinded life-saving guidance promoting the protection of transgender students, targeting young people, many of whom have parents here in the room today, for bullying and discrimination during the school day ahead. We've seen the appointment of anti-equality extremists, and frankly, not to mention rapists, to the federal bench and administration positions. We have seen the granting of a sweeping license to discriminate to government workers, federal contractors, and even healthcare professionals to deny critical services to LGBTQ people. And in a series of erratic tweets, although all of his tweets are erratic, the commander-in-chief targeted transgender troops for his hate and for his discrimination. So we are at a critical moment. And over the last few years, we have seen at the state level more than 100 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced in roughly 30 states across the country every single year. Those bills traditionally fall into two categories, and I know you here in Virginia are far too familiar with this type of legislation. The first is legislation seeking to license discrimination under the guise of religious freedom. Religious freedom is a fundamental American value, but what it has always been and what it should always remain is a shield to protect religious minorities from government persecution, and what it should never be is a sword to inflict harm on marginalized people. The second kind of attack we are seeing are these anti-transgender bills that seek to restrict access to restrooms consistent with our gender identity. Now, I'm sure one of the questions that many of you get, that I get very frequently, is why are we talking so much about bathrooms? And of course, my answer starts with transgender people would rather talk about, frankly, most things but bathrooms. We want to talk about dignity and fairness throughout daily life. And yes, that includes restrooms. But it's opponents of equality who are focusing in on restrooms. And they do it for two reasons. The first is that they understand that everyone feels a little bit uncomfortable in restrooms. Everyone feels a little bit vulnerable in those spaces, including transgender people. And so when these opponents can spread misinformation and build caricatures out of who transgender people are, people respond by saying, you know what, I'm already a little bit uncomfortable in the restroom. I don't want to be made even more uncomfortable by the person next to me. But the real reason and the second reason is more insidious than that. They understand that if they lose on everything else, but win on bathrooms, if they can legalize, legislate, and in some cases mandate discrimination in restrooms, it becomes the closest thing to a silver bullet to legislating that community out of public life. That is why restrooms have been at the center of every single battle for civil and human rights over the last 70 years. Opponents of equality focused in on restrooms during the fight for the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. They talked about bathrooms and predators during the early days of the gay rights movement in the 60s and 70s. They utilized bathrooms to stop the Equal Rights Amendment in the 70s. They talked about bathrooms during the fight for the Americans with Disabilities Act, and they're talking about bathrooms today in the fight for trans equality because they understand that if transgender people or any community cannot use restrooms that make sense for them, that match who we are, that don't otherize or stigmatize us, if we can't do that, then it becomes much more difficult for us to go to school, to go to work, or to leave our houses for more than a few hours. And so make no mistake, these efforts are nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt to push us out of public life, back into the shadows, and into the closet. And so we have our work cut out for us. We have significant challenges in our way, and the issues and the challenges we are facing are nothing more than our ability to live and participate in public life in this society. The stakes could not be higher. And we know that these challenges did not begin or end with the 2016 election. They aren't limited to politics and legislative halls. They also include our ability to exist in public life without fear of violence. I don't have to tell this room that the epidemic of violence against the transgender community is an urgent crisis. 2017 was the deadliest year on record for the transgender community. At least 29 transgender people, mostly trans people of color, particularly black transgender women, were killed. So far this year, 22 transgender people, at least, have been killed. We know that when transphobia mixes with misogyny and racism, it can have often deadly consequences. Which is why, as a movement, our fight can't just be about gender identity or sexual orientation and explicit protections in those fashions. We also have to acknowledge what Audre Lorde reminds us, which is that there's no such thing as a single issue cause because no one lives single issue lives. That's why we as a community and a movement have to push back anytime elected officials seek to rip healthcare away from millions of Americans, including those living with pre-existing conditions, including transgender people, women, and those living with HIV. It's why, as a movement launched in response to police violence at the Stonewall Inn, we must fight for racial justice and make clear that Black lives matter. It's why, as a community terrorized at the Pulse nightclub, we must work to combat the scourge of gun violence plaguing this country today. Every single fight for justice is inextricably linked. Every single movement for equality is united. But there's good news right now, despite all of the challenges we face. And that good news is that every single time anti-equality politicians and activists come for us, every single time they try to attack us or legislate and legalize discrimination, every single time they demonize us, we end up having a conversation with this country that serves to open hearts, change minds, and in the end sows the seeds of the destruction of the politics of hate that those activists seek to implement. We saw it in North Carolina. The Republican incumbent governor thought that he would be able to sail to re-election by targeting the transgender community for discrimination, lost re-election, the only incumbent Republican governor to do so in that election, in large part because he targeted the transgender community for discrimination. We saw it last year, here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, when the state legislature's self-designated chief homophobe and the prime sponsor of their anti-trans bill was ousted by an out transgender. is changing the landscape, that is changing the way we are fighting for equality, that is demonstrating our power not just as individuals who have claimed something that society has told us we should be ashamed of and walk forward from a place of pride, but you've demonstrated that we are powerful not just as individuals, but as a community. And that united together across our differences and across our diversity, we are unstoppable. We know that right now, there are so many challenges. But every single time someone in this room has a conversation, every single time you fight for inclusive policies in your workplaces, every single time you make a school safer or a hospital more inclusive, you set forth what RFK called a tiny ripple of hope. That when met with others creates a current so great that it can knock down the highest walls of oppression and persecution. Virginia is at the center of the fight for trans equality. And so goes Virginia, so goes the nation. The work you are all doing will not just change Virginia, but in doing so will transform this nation. Which is why it is so important to make sure that you've been given these cards, to make sure that you fill them out and send them to Speaker Cox. Because he is one of the most powerful politicians in this state who is standing in the way of equality. And what I have seen time and time again is that when our voices are heard, when we tell our stories, when we demonstrate that we are part of these communities, politicians can no longer look us in the eye and deny us the equal protection of the laws they swore to uphold. And so there is nothing more important in this session than leaving it today and filling this out to make sure your voice is heard, whether you're transgender or an ally, to make clear that politicians who either attack us or won't stand by us and for us, that we're going to come for them on election day, that we're going to demonstrate that they're going to pay. I know right now it can feel like we're almost lost as a country, that our politics and our society is so broken that we can no longer do big things. But if there is one thing that we have demonstrated as a movement, if there's one thing we've demonstrated as a community, through the flames of riots and the loss of a modern epidemic, we have demonstrated that all of us, even in the darkest moments and the most troubling times, we can bear witness to acts of amazing grace. We have been reminded throughout the history of our community and our movement that hope as an emotion, hope as a phenomenon only makes sense in the face of hardship. We have demonstrated through our tireless acts of amazing grace, through our unending courage and hope, that change is and always will be possible. I get to see it every single day in my job. I get to see it every single day traveling around this country, meeting young transgender people, sometimes 7, 8, 9 years old, around the nation. Young people like Libby, Max, and Meriden, who I watch march into the Texas state capitol as young transgender people with their heads held high to demand dignity and fairness, holding in one hand the knowledge of all of the hate that exists in this world, but holding in the other the knowledge that their identities are worth celebrating and that their lives matter. I get to see that change in the 7-year-old transgender girl named Lulu, whose first question to me was so filled with pride that it would not have made sense to my shame-filled 7-year-old self. She asked me quite simply, what's my favorite part about being transgender? I see it in the 13-year-old transgender girl named Stella, who when I met her and asked her what she wants to be when she grows up, she declared without any hesitation that she will be the first transgender president. What once seemed impossible, for those of us in this room who are transgender to live our truth and dream big dreams, is now very real to kids like Stella. The mere fact that these young people exist today, no matter the challenges, the mere fact that they exist today demonstrates how far we've come. For we as a community have transformed impossibility into possibility into reality. We have demonstrated that change is and always will be possible. But of course, we've not come this far to stop now. Not with so much work left to do. After all, the fundamental truth remains that no one in our community is totally equal until all of us, from the gay Muslim refugee to the non-binary undocumented immigrant to the transgender woman of color living right here in Richmond, until every single one of us is treated with dignity and fairness. But make no mistake, that day will come. And when it does, when our understanding of we the people finally includes all of us, a young transgender student will grow up and learn about the struggle for justice and equality in their history books, and never have to know what this progress felt like to all of us, because they will never know anything different. And that will be because of transgender people who marched and fought for a better tomorrow. It'll be because of advocates and activists who dreamed of a different world. It'll be because of our allies who spoke out and fought back. It will be because of all of us speaking out, fighting back, and bending the arc of the moral universe just a little bit more towards justice. So I want to thank you all for all of the work you're doing, for inviting me here today, and I'd love to answer any questions that you have. Thank you so much.